So it's time for some late night previews to catch up with what happened everything today and at the end of the day yesterday. So let's start with the card that's on the screen right now, and that's Aftermath Analyst. For 2 mana, you get a 1/3 Elf Detective that says when it enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards, pay 4 mana, sack it, return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this is kind of in the vein of the World Shaper card from the original Ixalan block, where you would attack for 3 to mill yourself, and if it died in combat or whatever, then you could go ahead and get all your stuff back. The problem a lot of people have had with that particular card is if people knew you wanted those lands out of the graveyard because you were playing like a lands matter type deck a la Titania, they weren't going to bother blocking, especially if they were at a high life total. They would just take the 3 damage and let your thing go, and you'd have to come up with a way to kill it. Well, mono green and those kind of green colored land decks really don't have a lot of ways to sacrifice creatures on their own, so it was a little bit harder to set off. This, however, even though you don't get the repeated milling effect off of it, you do get the benefit of having its own built-in way to sacrifice itself without having to go into things like Ashnod's altars and stuff like that that don't really fit into the deck with what you wanted to do with it anyways. So this could probably see play in any kind of multitudes of the different types of Titania decks out there, or maybe even Lord Windgrace, where you're ditching cards into the graveyard to get benefits off of it, or the Soul of Windgrace, which lets you go ahead and discard cards to do its stuff. So there's a lot of benefit here to those kind of land-centric decks to get lands out of your graveyard. Then we have the latest iteration of you're allowed to play as many copies of this card in your deck, so it kind of overrides the whole 1 per copy in the deck for Commander. And this is Slime Against Humanity. For 2 and a green, you get a sorcery that says, create a 0/0 green ooze creature token with trample. Put X counters on it, where X is 2 plus the total number of cards you own in exile and in your graveyard that are called Slime Against Humanity. And the deck can have any number of those cards. So this is, the green version of Relentless Rats or Rat Colonies, Shadowbone Apostles, like those kind of things. Persistent Practitioners in blue. And this gives us like a cool way to build up counters on these creatures. So we're in green, which is great because this is actually the colors that allow us to double counters or put additional counters on things as you go. There's a lot of talk about things like Thrumming Stone, because as you cast these, you get multiple copies and you ripple into them off of that. Locket of Yesterdays, just anything, ways to make this cheaper and easier to cast. You're going to want ways to go ahead and draw cards so you get multiple copies of this in your hand so you can set them off, or maybe even spell copies. I've seen Arcane Bombardment. That was the spell I wanted to talk. Where it exiles a copy of it, and then you get to cast the copies off of it, because you get to use the exiled copies and cast those off, and it counts all those exiled copies on the bombardment so that you can go ahead and get the bigger, badder oozes off of those as well, which makes this kind of different compared to some of those other ones, because those are all creatures for the most part. And then you got this one, which is a sorcery instead, that counts the exiled copies, unlike a lot of them where they're just like, well, if you've cast this many times, you get something off of it. So Dragon's Approach, I think, was the other one in red that did that, but it just counted how many times you cast the spell. So there's lots to talk about this one. Lots of people are going to be building this one. I know I'm going to be trying it out at some point. So for now, let's see what this one does, and I will loop around to it here in a few weeks and see if we can come up with something kind of spicy with this card. Speaking of spicy, we have a new charm. This is actually the Archdruid's Charm. For triple green, you get an instant that says, choose one, search your library for a creature or a land card, reveal it. If it's a land, you get to put it onto the battlefield tapped. If it's a creature, it goes to your hand, and then you shuffle. Put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. So it's it's not a fight card, it's a bite card. The creature just bites the opposing creature and most likely destroys it if you're going to do that. And then exile target artifact or enchantment. So I love modal spells, especially when you're limited to in your spaces in your deck. You want to be able to go ahead and easily be able to fit extra spells in there. And this is a good way to do it because you get the exile, for the artifacts, enchantments, you get a tutoring effect in there, and then you also get a bite card. So this has a lot of functionality, and anything, especially mono green decks, are going to probably want to get a copy of this for their collection to have on hand. Then we have our latest iteration of a god from the plane, and that is Anzrag the Quake Mole. For 4 mana, you get an 8/4 mole god that says whenever Anzrag the Quake Mole becomes blocked, Untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there is an additional combat phase, and you can pay 3 double red, double green, and Anzrag must be blocked this combat if able. So you can force them to block it, or, if they have to block it because they're taking too much damage, then you get your stuff. So what people have been suggesting is, one, make Anzrag indestructible, because, yeah, that works. Put lure or some other similar thing that says this creature must be blocked on it, rather than paying the 6 mana straight up on it. So then you make it indestructible and you force them to block it. So then you get basically infinite combats as long as your opponents have a blocker. There's a card from Doctor Who, I forget what it was called, that you can put counters on 2 separate creatures, and you can make them indestructible until end of turn. And then you can just swing with, and like the next time you have a combat, you just are able to swing with those 2 creatures and block with those 2 creatures. But once you get Anzrag going like that one time, the next combats don't count. So you're able to swing over and over and over again until your opponents are dead at that point, as long as you have a way to make all your stuff indestructible or force your way through just over and over again with Anzrag. Or in, other terms, make Anzrag have trample as well, so that then damage carries over if you force a small creature to block, and you're able to just run them over until they eventually die. Then we have a black variation of Stuffy Doll or Brash Taunter in that kind of vein, Barbed Servitor for 3 and a black. You get a construct. It's a 1/1 with indestructible. When it enters the battlefield, you suspect it, so then it gains menace and cannot block. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card and lose a life. And whenever it's dealt damage, target opponent loses that much life. So there's ways you can kind of build around this, where you can either try to get rid of that suspect counter that's on it or whatever. I don't think it's a counter. I think it's just a marker that indicates that it's suspected. And then there are ways to make things lose suspect. So you could use something like that to get that off, and then you can block with it. You can put lore effects, kind of like Anzrag, where you have to force this thing to get blocked. So then all that damage that they block with it, you end up slamming into your opponent's face. Or you can just, swing at them and for the cards, and eventually they're going to have to block this, especially if you have ways to pump it up and make it big enough into a pretty good sized threat that the damage is just going to get reflected in their face. And then with the whole, it has menace. If it has the suspect counter on it, then they have to actually block with 2 creatures. So then 2 creatures damage is actually hitting this thing. So as long as they don't have a way to make it, minus or exile it, this thing can be a royal pain for somebody as long as you're in black. So remember when I said, there might actually be a detective deck if they put enough detectives in this set? Well, everybody is apparently becoming a detective in this set, because we have a variation of Lazav, who is now a detective as well. This is Lazav, Wearer of Faces. For 2 mana, you get a 2/3 legendary shapeshifter detective that says when it attacks, exile target card from a graveyard, then investigate. And then it says whenever you sack a clue, you may have Lazav become a copy of that creature card that was exiled with it until end of turn. So, you attack, you exile a card, you sack a clue, and then one of the creatures that he's eaten out of the graveyard, you can make Lazav become a copy of it. So that's kind of an interesting graveyard hate / cloning effect. It just has a little extra hoop to jump through, because you have to have clues lying about in order to do what you need to do with this. So, it's kind of cool. I mean, it feeds itself with the attack trigger, because you're exiling and you're creating the clue at the same time. So as long as you're exiling something big enough or has some kind of special ability where he can come on through. So before blockers are declared, you can make him unblockable if they have an unblockable creature in their graveyard, or you can put flyer in there and exile a flyer. And you're going to want to have other ways to make these tokens, though, because you're going to have to mess around with your timing. I kind of like this card, though. I'm going to experiment with it. It also has the functionality of, like, maybe you want to treat this kind of like a funky reanimator type thing, where you're milling stuff into your graveyard and you're exiling it out to turn Lazav into those things like big demons and big leviathans and flyers and dragon flyers, stuff like that, just to, work with that functionality there. So I kind of dig this. Let's see what this thing can do in future videos. Crap. I didn't think about this when I created this new framing here. The cards are turned sideways. I don't have a way to turn them right now. But this is the return of the dual cards that you have one side or the other that you can cast. So we have Fuss and Bother. The Fuss side is 2 and a hybrid Boros. Put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control. That's pretty decent. 3 mana for, a counter on everything attacking. And then Bother is 4 and 2 Azorius hybrid. Create 3/1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying, and you surveil 2. So you get, for 6 mana, you get 3 Thopters, and then you get to surveil your top 2 cards. And then at instant speed, you can just, put all your attacking creatures up a counterpoint. Now, for these cards, I'm more impressed with the Boros side of the card because you're going to be able to pump stuff up and make your stuff better. The 6 mana just seems like a lot, even in Commander, and I don't see where I would really want to play this unless I was playing it in something like maybe a Brea Ethereum Shaper deck, and I was treating the deck like a Thopters Matter type deck, where I'm building up the Thopters and doing things to pump them up and get them out on the board. So that might be where I'd want to play it. But otherwise, I don't know too many places to play this because I'm not going to play that one side. I might play Fuss in like a Prowess deck or something like that that would really bolster up that damage, but otherwise not quite sure where else I want this card. The other dual card that they've revealed thus far is the Orzhov and Rakdos variation here with Push-Pull. The push side of the card is the Orzhov side for 1 and a hybrid Orzhov. Destroy target tapped creature, which is, that's on par, but usually that costs 3 mana to get that kind of thing. And then on the pull side for 4 and 2 Rakdos, you get to put up to 2 target creature cards from a graveyard. It's single a graveyard, it notes, onto the battlefield. They gain haste until end of turn, sacrifice in the beginning of your end step. So, you pick one of your graveyards, like your graveyard, or an opponent maybe have something stocked up because they are playing a graveyard-centric deck, something of that nature. You're going to want to go ahead and steal those things, swing at their face, and then you can sacrifice them or feed them into something that you have going on. If you steal your opponent's stuff, maybe you have some kind of thing where you exile stuff when you use it. There's some function there. Or you just steal the biggest, baddest things out of their yards and smash them in the teeth with it. Either way, both sides of this card equally have my attention, and I will be trying to mess around with them. So we're going to stick with some Orzhov fun here in Treacherous Greed. For 3 mana, you get an instant that says it is additional cost to cast it. You have to sacrifice a creature that already dealt damage this turn. So whether that's a pinger or you just, smash into somebody with it and then you can sacrifice it. So then like a spirit token would be ideal, or some kind of a little flying 1/1 type thing, because then you can just sacrifice that and it's a little bit easier to get it through. Then you draw 3 cards and each opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. Now, the cool part here is this card is actually in the colors that the vampires in the game a lot of them are printed in, including like Vito, Thorn of the Duskrows, or his other variation, Vito, the Fanatic of Aclazotz. So you get a functionality of, okay, you're going to gain this life and then you're going to make them lose life. And then they would actually lose more life off of Vito, the Thorn of the Duskrows, or because you're sacrificing stuff, it's another trigger for the Fanatic of Aclazotz. So there's some cool synergies there, and any kind of deck that's black and white, you're talking aristocrats, so you're going to get benefits out of the sacrifice, you're going to get benefits out of the drains, you're going to get benefit. There's all kinds of benefits that you get just for performing all parts of this card in the game. And hey, look, there's another card from my Titania deck. I love this. This is Undergrowth Recon for 1 and 2 green, an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So, like, if you're playing Lands Matter, if you're playing any kind of self-mill, recursionary graveyard shenanigans, like my Micro Tyrant deck I just did, once again, this would be a card that would be decent in there because you're able to replay lands, especially if you replay stuff like the Riveteer's Outlook, where you're able to, just play that card that self-sacrifices itself when it enters the battlefield over and over and over again. So you just play it, sack, and just do that over again. Fetch lands would be really good there too. So there's some different things that you can do with this card, and I can't wait to get a copy of it for my Titania deck. Then we have a case that's good for +1/+1 counter decks. This is Case of the Trampled Garden for 2 and a green. When it enters the battlefield, distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among creatures you control. And it says creatures you control that have total power 8 or greater solves the case. And once it's been solved, whenever you attack, you put a counter on target attacking creature. It gains trample until end of turn. So for 3 mana, you get a new variant on the Garruk's Uprising. So instead of letting you draw cards, it distributes counters across your creatures and gives them trample until end of turn. So you can kind of play around with, oh, I'll make this guy bigger, make this guy bigger, whatever. But then you're also granting them trample until end of turn. So that's kind of fun. Then we have a case that's kind of similar to Grafted Skullcap in Case of the Crimson Pulse for 2 and a red. When this case enters the battlefield, discard a card and then draw 2 cards. So you get your impulse draw where you're ditching a card to draw a couple cards. Then you also have the solve of having no cards in hand. So you have to be hellbent in order to get this thing to, do its solve part. But once it's been solved, at the beginning of your upkeep, discard your hand, then draw 2 cards. That's why it reminds me of the Grafted Skullcap, because at the end of your turn, you had to ditch your cards, but then you got to draw extra cards later. So in this case, you're going to get the function to discard your hand, which the first time up, your hand's going to be empty because it had to be empty to flip it over anyways. And then you're able to go ahead and cast those spells. Just remember, though, you can't hang on to them because you're going to end up ditching them later. So you want to run things that either you want to be able to resurrect off of it, you like reanimator type stuff, so you can ditch it and then do stuff. You're going to want to run things that you can flash back out of your graveyard. You're going to want to run things that you can cast, quickly, cheaply. There's different types of decks you're going to want to play something like this in. But again, red has a habit of not having a ton of great card draw. So this is just one more way for them to try and kind of give them a bone, basically. Like, here, you can have this kind of sort of crappy card draw, but then you got to use your cards really fast. So I kind of dig it, though. I want to try this card out, and I'm going to get a copy of it for a few different decks. Next up is the Hunted Bone Brute. Now, this is kind of in the vein of the old hunted cards, like the Hunted Troll, Hunted Horror, stuff like that, where it would create a couple creatures for your opponent, one of them, and you really couldn't swing at that opponent because then they would have the counter to it. It would just die, and they had like pro blue or pro whatever, so they couldn't get through. Well, this one doesn't have protection. It creates 2 1/1 dog tokens for a player. This thing has menace, so they have to block with both dogs in order to take the Bone Brute down because it's a 6/2. But then when the Bone Brute dies, each of your opponents loses 3 life, and then it has a disguise cost of 1 and a black, which is pretty good because then you can hide it as a 2/2. And if they're like, I'm not going to block that 2/2, you can just go flip it over and you're taking 6, not 2. Ideally, though, you could also play something like Illness in the Ranks, where creature tokens get -1/-1. So then the dogs don't matter because they won't survive the Illness in the Ranks, and then you're just free to swing at whoever you gave those tokens to in the first place. And then it also gets really good because then if you have something like a Blood Artist or the new Vein Ripper card, those dogs die, and then you get those death triggers, and then they get to ping your opponents down some more as well. Then we have the official card for the little mole thing they've been doing, their map promotional event that they've been doing with all these cards lately. This is the Tunnel Tipster for 1 and a green. It's a 1/1 mole scout. At the beginning of your end step, if a face-down creature enters the battlefield under your control this turn, put a counter on the Tunnel Tipster, and it taps for green. So it's a mana dork that grows if you're playing the disguised creatures or morphs or manifest, where you're manifesting cards off the top of your deck face down, or any of that kind of stuff that you have going on. You could mix it if you can get green into your decks with the Cybermen tokens from the Doctor Who stuff that turns those things face down and does that stuff. That would work too. There's some different stuff that could work with this. So as long as you have the face down creatures, he grows. Just remember, it only triggers 1 time with the way this is worded. It doesn't, because it just checks the 1 time for something coming into play. So it's not going to grow very fast unless you're having things that do like counter doubling or something like that. So bear that in mind if you want to build around this kind of card. Then we have the last card of the day, and it's a translation. It's Kylox's Voltage Strider is what it's translating to here. For 1, a blue and a red, it's an artifact vehicle that if you collect evidence 6, that means remove 6 converted mana costs from your graveyard from the game. It becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. When it attacks, if you can cast an instant or sorcery spell from among the cards that you exile with it, that spell would be put into a graveyard. You put it on the bottom of your library instead, and it also can be just crewed for 2 rather than having to collect the evidence. But you really want to collect evidence so you get that free cast. So if you have, instants and sorcerers in your yard, which blue-red ought to, you can go ahead and exile a couple of those with him, swing with it, get the free cast, lightning bolts or card draw spells or whatever you have going on in your graveyard. and then you put the card on the bottom of your deck. And then you could mix that. I was thinking about it just a little bit ago. You could mix that with the new Doctor Who legend River Song, where you're able to play cards off the bottom of your library. So you're just like, okay, I'll play this off the bottom. It goes to the graveyard. I exile it with the Voltage Strider. I put it back on the bottom. You just basically re-loop that card over and over again. Like I could see somebody doing something silly with like Time Warp, where they're like, I'll cast Time Warp off the bottom of my deck, or draw it off the bottom of my deck, cast it, exile it, cast it again with Kylox's Voltage Strider, put it on the bottom of the deck, and they just take infinite turns. As long as they're able to, attack and not get this thing dead in combat, they could, do some pretty busted stuff. So that's all I have for you guys today. That's all I found that was revealed in the last 24 hours or so. Let me know what you think down in the comments below of the new overlay that I've designed here. I thought my previews were looking kind of blah, so I thought I would come up with something to kind of dress it up a little bit. And we will see you guys in the next video, which will probably be on Monday with the next batch of previews.